How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the basics of photography, essentially photography 101.
This is going to be a comprehensive review. My name's dietschys.
Shut up! So when it comes to photography, what you're trying to do is you're trying to control light. A term that's thrown around a lot, pretty much 100% of the time in this industry, is exposure. Now I know all you starving artists there know exposure as the kind of thing that a lot of companies offer when they're trying to hire your services. This is not that kind of exposure.
Exposure was paying for a lot of things back then.
Yeah, at that point.
It was paying for all the Milos that I had to buy during the gigs.
You get free Red Bull? Oh, brilliant, man. We are coming.
This exposure essentially means how bright your image is. Now, for us to control exposure, we have three parameters or three checkpoints. The first one is something called the aperture. The second one is the shutter speed, and the third one is the ISO value. You're probably wondering, why do I need to know these three values or these three components? Well, if you're interested in photography, you need to know these three pillars, because everything revolves around these three pillars. No matter what kind of photography you're talking about, whether it's landscape photography, portrait photography, wedding photography, no matter what it is, you have to understand what these three components do to exposure, which is, the brightness of your image. Okay, let's start with the first checkpoint. The first checkpoint where when light enters your camera, it's first passing through aperture, right? The aperture is essentially how big the lens, how big the hole in your lens is. The way we measure aperture is we use something called the f-stop value, right? In conventional photography, it's f-stop. When it comes to cinema lenses, it's t-stop. I don't know how t-stops work. I just know how f-stops work. Now, it's a little hard to wrap your head around f-stops in the beginning, because when the f-stop number reduces, the size of the hole increases. So the f-stop value is inversely proportional to the size of the hole. Now that you know that I'm smart, it essentially means that if you reduce the f-stop value, the hole is going to get bigger, and if you increase the f-stop value, the hole is going to get smaller. Typically in a prime lens, you're going to get an f-stop value of somewhere between 1.8 to 22. So 1.8 is when the hole is at its largest, and 22 is when it's at its smallest. Now that you know what aperture is, the second checkpoint, or the second point where light passes through before you have your image, is the shutter speed. Now, to explain shutter speed, just imagine that you're looking at a room through a window, and this window has a curtain. What you're doing is you're adjusting how fast this curtain opens and closes. So depending on how fast it opens and closes, you are able to see into the room through the window only for that brief amount of time. Shutter speed is measured, relative to time, or relative to 1 second to be more exact. So let's say you have a shutter speed value of 1/10 of a second, which means you're taking 1 second, dividing it into 10 parts, and keeping the shutter open only for the duration of one of those components, or 1/10 of a second. So when you have the shutters open, or when you have the curtains open, you're letting light in through the window for a longer period of time. So that's the second checkpoint. Now the third checkpoint is something called the ISO. Now the ISO is something that changes from camera to camera, sensor to sensor. It is essentially how sensitive your sensor is to light. Now this can be adjusted with the ISO value. Typically in cameras, ISO starts at 100 ISO. That's essentially the measuring unit, and it goes all the way up to 10,000, 12,000, sometimes even like 120,000 ISO. Now, you have aperture, you have shutter speed, and you have ISO. Now let's just imagine, for you to get a perfect picture, you need 9 blocks of light in total. Now this is hypothetical. This is only for this example. I'm equating the measurement of light to a block. So let's say we equally divide these blocks to aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, so 3 blocks each. For you to come with a final image, a well exposed image, you need 9 blocks. Let's say you want to increase the aperture, which means you're increasing the f-stop value. By doing so, by taking it from f1.4 to f1.8, you're shrinking the aperture or the hole in the lens, which means you're taking light away. So once you take one block of light away from the aperture, you have to figure out whether you're going to reintroduce this block of light at the shutter speed, which is the second checkpoint, or the final checkpoint, which is the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the camera. Now, why would you want to do this? Because we know at the end of the day, if you want a good or well exposed or, you know, a picture with acceptable brightness, you need 9 blocks of light. So you have to make the decision whether you're going to introduce it at the shutter speed or whether you're going to introduce it at the sensor level, which is the ISO value. What you're doing is you're trying to balance the level of light that's coming through to the final image, you know, through these 3 checkpoints. Photography is building that instinct, or muscle memory is, you know, a more appropriate term, I guess. You're building that muscle memory to instinctively figure out where you want to take light from and where you want to reintroduce light to. And it's only these 3 components. You're probably wondering that this only applies to professional cameras. Well, no, even your smartphone nowadays come up with something called a manual mode, or in Samsung's it's called a pro mode, where you have to manipulate these things. Your smartphones, you know, take pictures in a virtual environment. It's essentially called computational photography, and they're creating these components, or at least the shutter speed and the aperture, in like a virtual environment, and they're mimicking how an image would react when you switch these things around. That's why these things are getting, you know, better and better. They're taking the manual modes on these cameras and putting it in here. Now you're probably asking, okay, why would I want to reduce the shutter speed, or why would I want to change the f-stop value or the aperture value? Well, that's coming up next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit a like on this video, don't forget the bell notification, and yeah, leave a comment on this video if I've missed out on any of the basics, or if there's something I need to touch on in the next video. So until the next one,